I'm glad you guys are here. Tonight, we are in the third week of our Back to the Basics series, where we have been for the past several weeks and for the next several weeks, we are going back to the basics of the Bible. As I've said the last couple weeks, here at Fellowship West, the Bible is the foundation of our beliefs. It's why we gather here every week, and it's the base of all that we do here. But the Bible can be an intimidating book. It can be confusing. It can be hard to understand at times. And so breaking it down into smaller, easy to understand, easy to digest sections allows us to understand it more, allows the story of the Bible to come to life, allows it to make more sense. And so over the next several weeks, and the past 2 weeks, we are walking through 9 generalized categories of the Bible that can make it easier for us to understand. Each week of this series, as we've done the last 2 weeks, we are overviewing the 9 sections because it's important for us to know the overall flow of how it all works together. And then we're talking about what each section entails, and then we're going to break it down and study one section of these 9 sections each week. And so we're going to talk about what that section entails, how it contributes to the overall story of God's plan, and how it applies to us. Those are the 3 things we're doing each week. So I think, like I said, it's important for us to understand the overall flow, how it all fits together. And so each week I'm going to recap, and then we're going to walk through the whole 9 sections as a whole. And so if you haven't been with us, or maybe if you just forgot, you've slept a couple times between last Wednesday and this Wednesday, we're going to start off with a quick recap. So in week 1, we overviewed the 9 sections and spent time breaking down creation. We looked at Genesis 1 and 2 and creation Psalms, and some of the books of Job, all the things that talk about creation in the Bible. We saw that the creation section of the Bible lays the foundation upon which the rest of the story, and in turn our faith, is built. And we saw that remembering creation gives us reason to praise God for who He is and what He has done, and how He loves us in spite of the fact that we're mere specks to Him. And then last week we looked at sin, the sin section of the Bible. We saw that the sin section consists of Genesis 3 through Exodus 19, or in other words, from the fall of man until the foot of Mount Sinai. So traveling during that whole time, all the stories that were wound within then. We saw how the perfect design that God had built was broken by sin. And we saw how sin impacts humanity and causes us to rebel against God and breaks the relationship that we're designed to have with Him. And we also talked about how this section created the problem that launched God's plan and required a solution, which we have been given through Jesus. Now, this week, we're going to be picking up where we left off and talking about the law section of the Bible. We'll talk about what the law section entails. We'll talk about how the law section plays into God's plan as a whole. And we'll talk about how the law section can apply to our lives today. I know a lot of times the law section is the section that people are the most or the least looking forward to, the most least. Every time someone starts talking about the law of the Old Testament, people are like, oh gosh, I don't want to hear Leviticus or all those old laws that don't matter to us anymore. But we're going to see tonight that the law section is a really important part of the Bible, and it can be really impactful for us if we understand it, if we read it with the proper mindset. But before we begin to break down this section of the Bible, let's start off by reviewing the 9 sections as a whole. All right, Jolie's already got it. So come on up here, Miss Jolie. And I'm going to give you a mic, and you're going to walk us through the 9 sections as a whole, telling the story of the sections as best as you can, and not just saying the words, okay?
The first one was the creation. Made everything in the earth and us. And then the next one was when sin entered the world, when Adam and Eve sinned for the first time. The third one was the law. That was like the 10 Commandments. The fourth one was...
Oh, it's on you. He's following you.
The fourth one was...
The law couldn't oversee itself. And so
and so they had the judges, and then they didn't want judges, so they got kings, and then the priests had to go tell, or the prophets had to go tell about the King of Kings.
There you go.
The good news about and coming to save us on the cross, and then he built the church, and then he went up to heaven and told us about the promise
What promise?
that he would return one day.
There you go. Great job. Everybody give her a hand. You can take a candy from this and then just give it to Melissa when you're done. Great job. So yeah, that was perfect. That's exactly the 9 sections, walking through those 9 primary sections of the Bible. Hopefully, each one of you who have been here over the last 2 weeks could do that. And we're going to continue. I'm going to have 1 or 2 of you each week come up and walk us through that for a prize. So I think it's important for us to know. And the reason that it's important for us to know this is because it allows us to understand the Bible. It allows us to flip to any passage that we flip to and read it and have an idea of where it's at in the Bible and know what came before it and know what's coming after. It gives you an overall bird's eye view of how God's plan goes. And also it gives you a really quick and easy way to share the gospel with someone. Someone comes up to you and they say, well, Abby, what do you believe? What is your, you say you're a Christian, what does that mean? You can say, well, I believe this. I believe that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but then everything was perfect. Everything was exactly how God intended it to be. But then man came and we sinned. We rebelled against God and sin entered the world, and our relationship with God was broken and a problem was created that required a solution. And so God gave us the law as a remedy for that problem, but the law couldn't oversee itself. And so God sent the judges to oversee the law, but the people didn't want judges. They wanted kings like the surrounding nations. And so they elected for themselves a king, but the kings divided the nations and caused all kinds of problems. So God sent the prophets to go and to tell the people of Israel that the King of Kings was coming and that the King of Kings was going to come and he was going to solve all the problems. He was going to be the Redeemer, the Messiah of the world. And then the King of Kings came and he lived a perfect life and he died an undeserving death on the cross. And he told us that we would be his people and he would be our Redeemer. And he was buried in a tomb and he rose 3 days later, conquering death and sin once and for all. And then he came and he established a church with a great commission to go and make disciples of all nations. And then he promised before he ascended back into heaven that he was going to return for us. And so it's a quick and very easy way to share the gospel in under a minute. I've talked about that every single week, and I want to nail that home with you guys so that I want you to be able to walk out of these 9 weeks where we're walking through this and be able to do that, be able to walk up to someone who doesn't know about the Bible and be able to walk them through the story of God's plan. And so that's why we're doing this. That's why I think it's important to walk through each of these 9 sections. But once again, we cannot just leave our understanding on the basic level. And so that's why we're breaking down the sections, and we're not just simply talking about the 9 sections as a whole, but we're breaking them down and spending a day on each one. And so tonight, let's do that by looking at the law. And so we'll start off by talking about what the law section entails. The law section of the Bible picks up in Exodus 20, right where the sin section left off. It's in Exodus 20 that we see the 10 Commandments being given to the people of Israel. So if you have a Bible, turn with me to Exodus 20. If you don't have a Bible, you can come up and borrow one from the Bible box, or it will be on the screens. And so starting in verse 1 of chapter 20 of Exodus, it says this. Now, I'm reading a lot of big sections tonight, so bear with me. We'll get through it. It's good stuff. So it says, and God spoke all these words, saying, he's speaking to the whole nation of Israel right now from the clouds on Mount Sinai. He says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers on the children and to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but bestowing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God, and on it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Verse 12, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off. And they said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die." And Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin." And the people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And so here we see the Ten Commandments being given, and God is speaking to the whole nation of Israel, and he's telling them these list of rules. He says, don't have any other gods before me, don't have any carved images, don't use my name in vain, or you need to honor your father and mother, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't slander or tell lies about someone, and don't covet. Don't want something that someone else has that you don't. And so all these things, these laws, these commandments seem pretty straightforward, and you would think that a list of 10 rules shouldn't be too hard to follow, right? I mean, whenever I take y'all on a trip or to camp or to D-Now or when we went down to Branson, I give you guys a list of rules, right? We have a rules meeting where I bring your parents in here, and I sit down and I'm like, these are the rules, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, this is what you can bring, this is what you can't bring. If you do this, you'll get sent home, so on and so forth. I give you a list of rules. Sometimes it's more than 10 rules, and honestly, you guys are awesome, and I've never had an issue. I've never had any problems. You guys follow the rules for the most part pretty well. But as we will see, the people of Israel, like all of us, had a hard time following the rules that they were given. And so over the next several chapters of Exodus, we see several things happen. First of all, we see that Moses is summoned up to Mount Sinai, and if you notice in this first section that we just read, God is speaking directly to the people. But whenever he finished, the people were afraid. They couldn't stand to be that close to the presence of God. They couldn't, hearing God's voice was frightening to them. And so they're like, hey, Moses, listen, we'll listen to you, and you can go and talk to God and then come and tell it to us, but we don't want to hear from him directly anymore. Like, we want you to be our messenger. You can go up there and talk to him and then come back and tell us what he has to say. And so Moses is brought up to the mountain, to the top of Mount Sinai, where God breaks down the law by giving smaller, more specific rules, a whole lot of them. And then we see God's covenant or God's promise confirmed with Moses and a few of the elders of Israel. We see God give instructions for how the people of Israel should worship, how they should build a tabernacle or the temporary place of worship before the temple was built. We see the people of Israel in chapter 32. We see them break the clear commands that God gave them about having no other gods when they worship the golden calf in Exodus 32. And so what had happened was they had received these commandments. They had all heard it. And so it's like if I was sitting in here and I told all of you exactly what I wanted you to do, and then Melissa and I left, and you're like, hey, Melissa, we don't want to hear from Tyler anymore. He's too scary. And so you go and you listen to him, and then you can come back and tell us. And so Melissa and I go, and we hang out on the top of a mountain for like 40 days. And then as you guys are waiting, you're sitting there, and you're like, man, Melissa's been gone a long time. She's probably dead. Let's worship something else. And so instead of doing what I've asked you to do, not that you're worshiping me, but you're abiding by what I've asked you to do, but instead of doing what I've asked you to do, you decide to do whatever you want to do. And so the people of Israel, Moses had gone up on the mountain. He'd been up there for a long time. They're like, yeah, I don't know. He's been up there for like 40 days now, so he's probably dead. We need to find someone else to worship. And so they go to Aaron, Moses' brother, and they're like, hey, Aaron, we got all this gold we brought from Egypt, and so if we give it to you, will you make us a god? And so Aaron is like, that sounds like a good idea. And so he melts it all the gold, and he forms it into a golden calf, and they worship the golden calf. And they say that this is the God that brought us out of Egypt, this false idol, this thing that they created. That's what brought them out of Egypt. And when that happens, God knows it because he's all-knowing, and he tells Moses, he's like, hey, man, your people screwed up, so you need to go down there and fix it. And so Moses goes down the mountain, and he's got the stone tablets that God wrote the commandments on, and he sees what happens, and he throws the commandments on the ground and breaks them out of rage, and he's clearly distraught about what happens. And then after this, God wants to destroy the nation of Israel and to start over with Moses. But Moses interceded for Israel and convinced God to give them another chance. Then for the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we see a whole bunch of law given, a whole bunch of law mixed within the narrative that describes Israel's time in Mount Sinai and their wandering in the wilderness. And so this is a map. If you can see it, it's the best map that I could find that kind of described it. And so the purple is kind of their trail that they wandered around in. Over here on your left is Egypt, and over here on your right is the promised land where they were trying to get to eventually, way up there in the top right corner. And so really what would have been really fast for them to do is just go right straight there. Like in parkour, the fastest route from A to B is a straight line, right? And so you go over whatever is there. But because they sinned with the golden calf, God would not, he didn't kill them right there. That was him showing mercy, but he would not allow any of that generation to enter the promised land. And so he had them wander around and make this gigantic loop so that people, that generation would all die off, and the people that would enter the promised land would be their children. And so they wandered in the desert for like 40 more years until the children were the ones who entered the promised land. And it was during this time that we see around 613 laws given for Israel to follow during that whole, in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. We see around 613 laws given for Israel to follow. These laws include laws about how to live, laws about how to maintain yourself, how to groom yourself, how you should keep your beard, how you should keep your hair, how you should do everything. Laws about what you could eat, what you could not eat, and laws about sacrifices. In addition to giving the laws and the narrative that surrounds it, the law section also includes the book of Joshua, which describes Israel taking over the promised land of Canaan, but our focuses tonight are going to stay on the law and its purposes. So that is what the book entails. I know it's a lot. These sections are getting longer and longer. The first section is like, oh yeah, a couple chapters. I can walk through all of that. Third section is like, okay, it's just a few more chapters, but still not too much. And then this chapter is like, okay, this is like 4 or 5 books. Like, it's a lot. So we don't have time to break down every single section. So we're going to be talking about how the law as an entity, how the commandments that God gave Israel played into the overall plan that God was laying forth. And so as we talked about last week, when sin entered the world, a problem was created, and our relationship with God was broken, and therefore a solution was necessary. And throughout the last couple of weeks, you've heard me talk about the law as a remedy for sin, right? Do you guys remember me saying a remedy for sin? Okay, so we're going to talk about that's an important thing tonight. So keep that in mind. What this means is that it was a temporary method of easing the symptoms of a sin infection. We'll call it that. Think about it like this. I'm going to use this analogy. How many of y'all have ever had a sinus infection before? Okay. For those of you who haven't, it stinks. It's not fun. What happens with a sinus infection is you get some bacteria that create an infection in your sinuses, which are up in here back in your skull, and it causes all kinds of problems. It gives you a stuffy nose, it gives you a terrible headache, gives you a sore throat. It causes all kinds. You got drainage running down the back of your throat. It's awful, especially as a musician or someone who sings or someone who speaks. It's not fun. And so, if you have a serious sinus infection, you get all these symptoms, and the ultimate cause is the bacteria that's in your sinuses. And so the solution to the problem would be to go to the doctor and get antibiotics, right? So this is amoxicillin. And so if you were to go to the doctor and they were like, hey, yeah, you've got a sinus infection, they would prescribe you something like this, an antibiotic that would go in and would directly fight that bacteria that's causing that infection. That would be the direct solution. But a remedy to help the symptoms would be like taking Tylenol for the headache. Because you got a headache and you want to get rid of that headache, and so you take some Tylenol. But beyond the headache, you also you're all congested, and so you need to take some Sudafed for the congestion. So you got Tylenol for the headache, you got Sudafed for the congestion, and so that helps a little bit. Now you can kind of breathe, and your head doesn't hurt quite as bad, but your throat hurts really bad. And so you need to go to the store and get some cough drops, and you suck on some cough drops for a while. But after a while of sucking on cough drops, your mouth gets all dry and it's not, they start to taste really bad. And so you also want to get some chloroseptic spray or some sore throat spray that you can spray on the back of your throat. And then all in all, you're still not feeling super well. Your nose still feels kind of congested, and so maybe you're just going to pull the big guns out and get a neti pot and use a neti pot to clear your sinuses, right? That's actually a teapot, but he's trying to use it as a neti pot. And so a remedy, trying to remedy your problem over the counter is like using all of these things to try and solve a sinus infection that one round of antibiotics would fix. I'm really bad about this, medically speaking. I grew up, my dad's a pharmacist, and so I am under the mindset that I can fix any illness that I have with over-the-counter medicine. And so you can ask Melissa, there's times when I'm popping like 4 or 5 different types of pills to try and fix whatever's going on with me instead of going to the doctor and getting the one thing that would fix it all by itself. Instead, I'm trying to use all these different remedies to ease the symptoms. So these things may help the symptoms, however, they do not solve the problem. Because eventually, all those things are going to wear off. The Tylenol is going to wear off, you're going to have to take more. The Sudafed is going to wear off, you're going to have to take more. The cough drop's going to go away, you're going to have to eat another one. The chloroseptic spray only lasts a few seconds anyways, honestly. And the neti pot, you're going to have to keep using them, and it's really gross to use. And so they don't solve the problem. In the same way, the law was given to Israel as a remedy for the problem of sin. Okay? It helped with the symptoms of sin by encouraging them to live in a manner that God called them to, telling them these are the way that you should live. This is what you should do. And in order to not sin, you should try and do these things. These are how you should live. It helped to set Israel apart from other nations by giving them distinguishing rules to follow as God's people so that when people looked at them, they're like, those guys are different. There's clearly something going on there. I wonder what it is. Oh, it's that they're God's people. And then it also, the big thing is it gave them an avenue through which they could interact with God despite the relationship still being broken. And so it's through these laws that they were able to still interact with God on some level. Because if you remember in the Garden of Eden, when sin entered, the relationship was broken. We were no longer able to dwell with God because God is holy and he is unable to dwell with sin or sinful creatures. And because we're sinful, God cannot dwell with us. He cannot be a part of us. He cannot look on us because we're broken, we're sinful, we're dirty. And so these laws gave them some avenue to still interact with God despite the relationship still being broken. But the problem of sin still existed, and the relationship with God was still damaged. And the people continued breaking the laws, and they continued sinning. And this is why the sacrificial system was introduced. As I said earlier, there were many laws that were given in Leviticus especially, but also some in Exodus and some in the other books that describe proper sacrifices. And so the purpose of the sacrifices was to temporarily cover the blood debt that was owed for the sins that were committed. If you remember last week, I pointed out that Romans 6:23 says that for the wages of sin is death. And what this means is that when sin occurs, death is owed. And so when we sin, death is owed. Remember what God warned Adam and Eve about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the one that they were not supposed to eat of? He said, if you eat of it, you will surely die. And when they ate of it, sin entered the world and death was owed. A blood debt came into existence. And so the sacrificial system was a way of remedying the blood debt. It was a temporary way to try and absolve that blood debt. The animal sacrifices did not completely rid them of their sins. It temporarily paid the blood debt, but when sin was committed again, the blood debt was back. It's like a gambler who racks up a bunch of debt to a loan shark, and then they turn around, they're like, hey, I can't do this, and they find somebody to come and to pay it for them, and they're like, oh, thank you, okay, pay the loan shark, and you turn around and you immediately go back to the slots, and you immediately start racking up that debt again. That's essentially what we're like, or what it was like in this time. They would try and solve their blood debt with these animal sacrifices, but then they would turn around and sin again, and the blood debt was right back over their head. Throughout Leviticus, there are 5 different types of sacrifices that are described. We're going to walk through them because they're important for us to understand with some of the stuff we're talking about tonight. And so the first is burnt offerings. Okay, so these were voluntary and served a dual purpose: to atone for general sin and to demonstrate complete dedication to God. They consisted of bringing an animal to be slaughtered and burned on the altar. And the type of animal was dependent upon why they were bringing it and how wealthy they were. The next type of sacrifice is a grain offering. These were also generally voluntary offerings and were offered as a gift to God when the individual was seeking a favor from God or expressing gratitude for his provision. They consisted of flour, oil, bread, other grain type things. And some was burned as an offering to God, and the rest belonged to the priests as a tithe for them. The next type of sacrifice were peace offerings. So these were voluntary and signified the peace that existed between God and the individual offering the sacrifice. It consisted of an animal, again, the type of which depended on the wealth of the individual that was brought and sacrificed and burned. And the next type is sin offerings. Now, these were required sacrifices that were offered for sins that were committed unknowingly or unintentionally. How many of you guys have ever sinned unintentionally or without meaning to? I know I have. We can all be honest here. And if you're not raising your hand, you're probably lying, and therefore you're sinning unintentionally right now, or intentionally. So sin offerings were offered for sins that were committed unknowingly or unintentionally. And these also consisted of animals based on the individual's wealth. And the final type is guilt offerings. And these are required sacrifices that were offered for sins that were committed knowingly or intentionally. And so these also consisted of animals based on an individual's wealth that were brought and sacrificed and burned as an offering to God. And so all of these sacrifices had to be made regularly. That's a lot. If you think about it, on an average trip to the temple to make an offering, to make a sacrifice, it would not be uncommon for someone in that time to give all of those. And so that's 4 different animals and then a bunch of grain stuff. Like that's a lot. And if you had to do that every time that you messed up, every time that you told a lie, every time that you sinned in some way, shape, or form, like that, it blows my mind to think about how many lambs were sacrificed. And when I was reading through Leviticus a few months ago in our Route 66 reading plan, there was like a whole chapter where after every single thing it described, it was like, and then they offered 8 lambs and 2 goats. And I'm like, what? Like, that's so many lambs. How were there still lambs in the world? It blows my mind. And so all of these were offered and made regularly in order to maintain the remedy for sin. Like I said, it's like whenever I'm sick and I'm trying to cure my problems with over-the-counter medicine, and so I have to take Tylenol every 6 hours, I have to take Sudafed every 4 hours, I have to take cough drops like every 20 minutes, I have to use the throat spray every time that I can. Like, it's a lot. But once a year, the Day of Atonement comes. In Hebrew, it's Yom Kippur, which is a Jewish holiday now. And on this day, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, or the innermost chamber in the tabernacle, which is where God's presence dwelt. It was sealed off by a thick veil, and the high priest would only enter it once a year. And when he did this, they would tie a rope around his ankle so that if he were to die, because he wasn't holy enough, that he would be drug out. That way they could pull him out without convicting themselves. And so he could not just walk in there willy-nilly. Leviticus 16 describes the extensive process that he had to undergo in order to do this. So I'm going to just kind of glaze over this really quick. Starting in verse 11 of Leviticus 16, it says, "And Aaron, the high priest, shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make him atonement for himself and for his house. And he shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself." Then in verse 15 it says, "And he shall kill the goat of the sin offering that is for the people, and bring its blood inside the veil, and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it over the mercy seat and in front of the mercy seat." And in verse 18 it says, "And then he shall go out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it, and shall take some of the blood of the bull and some of the blood of the goat, and put it on the horns of the altar all around." And then in verse 20 it says, "And when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat. And Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions and all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. And the goat shall bear all their iniquities on itself to a remote area, and he shall let the goat go free into the wilderness. And Aaron shall come into the tent of meeting and shall take off the linen garments that he put he put on when he went into the holy place, and shall leave them there. And he shall bathe his body in water in the holy place, and put on his garments, and come back out, and offer his burnt offering and the burnt offering of the people, to make atonement for himself and for the people. And in verse 30 it says, "For on this day shall atonement be made for you to cleanse you, and you shall be clean before the Lord from all your sins." And so this was the process, and this was this sacrifice that made atonement that would be for the whole nation. Now, atonement is a churchy word that means reconciliation, or to make right a wrong. And so by making this sacrifice, the high priest was righting the wrongs done by the whole nation of Israel, and putting the sins of the nation on the head of the goat, and offering a bull as a burnt offering. Now, once again, this atonement was only temporary because the people would sin again. This sacrifice was enough to remedy the problem, but not to cure it. So finally, real quick, as we're wrapping up here, we'll talk about how the law applies to us. The law section of the Bible describes how the problem of sin was remedied, but it also serves as a shadow for the ultimate sacrifice, bringing the ultimate atonement for sin. See, because sin existed, blood was required. The animals offered provided a remedy, but didn't solve the problem completely. But we see in the New Testament that Jesus came and lived a perfect life and offered himself as a perfect sacrifice, through which the substitutionary atonement could be had for all people. Now, substitutionary atonement meaning an offering that righted the wrongs through substitution. And so someone took our place. Jesus, like the goat on the Day of Atonement, had the sins of the world, the sins past, present, and future, placed on his head, placed on his shoulders, becoming the ultimate fulfillment of the law. And he took our sins and became the sacrifice that was our substitute, and took our death. And because of this, our relationship with God is no longer based on what we do, but on what Christ has done. And when God looks at us, he sees us as he sees Jesus. And Jesus stands between us and God and allows us to have a relationship with God once again. So reading the law section of the Bible can be one of the most challenging sections to read. I know it. It's often avoided by many Christians because we don't feel like it applies to us because we're no longer under the law. But when we read the law section of the Bible with Christ's sacrifice and this substitutionary atonement that we receive in mind, it makes the sacrifices and the laws of the Old Testament be seen as a shadow of the grace that we have been given. And when this happens, it makes these passages exciting to read because it reminds us that of what we have been saved from, and how Christ's sacrifice really saves us. And so that's how the law section plays in. That's how it applies to our lives. And so as we continue through this series over the next several weeks, we'll continue to see how God's plan for redemption plays out as we continue to go back to the basics. Let's pray.